Okay, I think it's 3 minutes past 4 o'clock. We'll get started here. We're also approaching almost 100 participants, which is wonderful to see. So welcome to the second meeting of the Fairbanks Center's Modern China Lecture Series. My name is Arunabh Ghosh. I teach modern Chinese history here in the history department at Harvard here. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know about our two upcoming talks, just so you can mark your calendars. On October 27th, 2 weeks from now, we'll welcome Wang Feixian from IU Bloomington, who will deliver a talk titled Everybody Loves Qianlong, Vernacular Fantasies, Cultural Consumption, and the Prosperous Age in Post-Imperial China. And 2 weeks after that, on November 10th, we will welcome Kovel Maiskins from the Naval Postgraduate School, and he'll deliver a talk titled Mao's Massive Military-Industrial Campaign to Defend Cold War China. I think both announcements are already up, so if you Google their names in the Fairbanks Center, you should be able to find the details, but we will be making formal announcements in the coming days, so please look out for them, and please mark your calendars. October 27th and November 10th, both are Tuesdays at 4 p.m. But today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Gina and Tam, who will be delivering a talk entitled Dialect and the Making of Modern China, from Republican Revolutionaries to Hong Kong Protesters. Gina is a historian of modern China. Her specialization is on the construction of collective identity in modern China, so things like national belonging, ethnicity, and race. She received a PhD from Stanford in 2016 and is currently an assistant professor at Trinity University in Texas. She is the author of Dialect and Nationalism in China, 1860 to 1960, which was published earlier this year by Cambridge University Press, so many congratulations for that. Her new project, she's now working on a global history of Chinese restaurateurs and the making of Pan-Asian cuisine in the 20th century, which sounds quite exciting, quite delicious actually. So before I hand things over to her, a few quick words about format. So Gina will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for roughly the same length of time. And we'll plan to finish by about 5:15 to 5:30, depending on how the conversation goes. If you have questions, I would encourage you to use the Q&A section and type them up. You're free to start typing them up during the course of the talk, and I'll try and get to as many of them in the Q&A session. Before typing, I would request you identify yourself, but at the same time, please note that the webinar is being recorded, so if you would prefer to stay anonymous, that's of course perfectly fine as well. Okay, so without further ado, let me hand things over to Professor Tam.
Okay, thank you so much, Arnab. Thank you for inviting me to do this talk. Thank you to the Fairbanks Center for making this happen. And thank you to all of you for spending your Tuesday afternoon here listening to me talk about my work. I'm really, really excited to share it with you. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, which should be possible, I think, hopefully. Give it a second. New world of tech. Let's see. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so there we go. As Arunabh mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit today about my new book called Dialect and Nationalism in China, 1860 to 1960. And to start us off, I want to start with a story from a few years ago from the city of Hong Kong. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. In 2016, the Hong Kong Department of Education sent out a packet of supporting reference materials for instructors teaching the Chinese national language, Mandarin, to school children in the Special Administrative Region. Unexpectedly, this unassuming assemblage of short articles about language pedagogy made headlines across Hong Kong. And the reason was because one of the articles, among many, made the argument that Cantonese, the Chinese language most frequently spoken in the city of Hong Kong, could not be considered a mother tongue. So now the argument centered on the linguistic categorization of Cantonese. The author, a university consultant from mainland China, argued that mother tongues are languages and its speakers belong to one ethnic group. Cantonese speakers are Han Chinese, he continued, and there's only one language that could represent the Han ethnicity, which is Mandarin, or in the PRC, we'd call it Putonghua, and in Taiwan, we'd call it Guoyu, right? Cantonese, on the other hand, he called a Fangyan, a term that if we sort of broke it apart, right? So like Fang means place and Yan means language, so like language of place. It is one of dozens, if not hundreds, spoken throughout China, as we can see broadly from this map here, which shows broad Fangyan regions in China. But I don't even think that this actually captures linguistic diversity because within each of these Fangyan regions, there's a lot of diversity as well, which I think this map kind of highlights. Now in English, Fangyan are most commonly translated as dialects, right? That's the usual English translation. And this is certainly how the author of this article saw it. So for men like this university consultant, Fangyan, like dialects, are variants of a Chinese language, whereas Putonghua, defined as the common language of the Chinese people, is its standard representative. So as China's representative language, he argued, it alone can be considered a mother tongue. Now, this claim elicited a fierce backlash in Hong Kong as Hong Kong journalists, everyday citizens, even the chief executive declared that Cantonese was their mother tongue, right? We even get signs like mothers speak Cantonese, mother tongue, right? The consultant who wrote this, but like the consultant who wrote this article, the refutations that they articulated to sort of debunk this idea focused also on the proper linguistic categorization of Cantonese. Take, for instance, one detractor, a graphic artist who goes by Otto, and he's the author of several books on Cantonese idioms that frequently feature an adorable character, primary school chicken. Oh, I went one too far. There we go. So primary school chicken, right? So here, Otto's chicken stands in front of a sketched out chalkboard. This is one of 4 slides here where he's teaching his readers the objective definitions of language and dialect, right? And he does use the term dialect. He translates Fangyan as dialect. Now, he argues dialects are mutually intelligible with both its core language and other related dialects. Cantonese, on the other hand, is not mutually intelligible with Putonghua. Similarly, dialects have much of their grammar and syntax in common with the language that they are supposedly a variant of, whereas Cantonese has its own grammatical patterns and vocabulary. Dialects are informal, primary school chicken tells us, and they don't have a writing system, whereas you can write Cantonese, as this slide here, as one of a series, is meant to show. So by this definition, primary school chicken is arguing here, the relationship between Cantonese and Mandarin is akin to the relationship between, for example, French and Portuguese, which are similar languages to be sure, but they are first and foremost languages. Now, it's interesting that the debate over the technical definition of a language and a dialect would result in such fierce outrage. And the reason, I believe, is because the stakes of this debate extend far beyond such technicalities. By calling something a language or a dialect, we bestow upon it significances and limitations that can extend far beyond the narrow definition of the category itself. Calling Putonghua a national standard and Fangyan variants implies that Putonghua can represent China in a way that Fangyan cannot, any Fangyan cannot. And this isn't just me saying this, it's really easy to find rhetoric that implies this hierarchy. For instance, a frequently used textbook on the history of language in China, in it, the author writes that Putonghua is the only language that allows the Chinese nation to be preserved, develop, and progress. I collected a lot of newspaper articles that have school children reciting, "We are Chinese, we therefore speak Putonghua." Even this image here out of the city of Shanghai, this girl is holding a sign that says, "Promulgate Putonghua, build together the China dream." Now, the emotional stakes of this debate, I think, are also captured in so the final image that Otto drew here about this debate, which is here, right? It's a simple drawing of his childlike chicken, surrounded by soft silhouettes of horses and hearts and cats and flowers. And in it, the chicken declares, "Cantonese is my mother tongue." Now, this is a really sentimental image, but that sentimentality disguises a strident defensiveness. Otto is arguing against a person seeking to devalue his native language and in so doing, devalue the significance of his own identity. Otto's chicken, powerfully declaring what his mother tongue is, seems to understand that the stakes of Cantonese being a mere dialect means that he himself could also be considered just a variant of a national standard. This episode encapsulates the core argument of my book. Put simply, my book argues that Fangyan are central to understanding how Chinese national identity emerged and formed in China from the end of the 19th century through the 1960s. I argue that Fangyan's significance can be detected throughout this period in 2 interlocking narratives. On the one hand, there were those who argued that Chinese identity needed to have a sole standard linguistic representative. People who argued this believed that Fangyan, or called Fangyan subsidiaries, non-standards, some even called them obstacles to an idealized national identity. On the other hand, however, there were opposing groups who revered Fangyan as having a historical and emotional connection to the nation that was more authentic than that of the Chinese national language. Fangyan, for these groups, were pieces of historic heritage and tools for expressing authentic emotions and subjectivities. These narratives each tell their own story about Chinese nationalism as a whole. The former tells us how homogenization subsumes and discredits visions of the Chinese nation that run counter to the standard. The latter emphasizes the persistence of a bottom-up declaration that national culture, that national culture can be flexible and heterogeneous. When taken together, however, we see that these two narratives informed and shaped one another, and in the process, collective identity as a whole. I thus propose in my book that we study these two narratives not as simply coexisting, but as mutually co-constructive. In other words, I contend that they evolved and shaped one another throughout the 20th century, and more importantly, that it's through these interactions, the interactions of these narratives, rather than focusing on one narrative of the other, that we can best understand national identity in 20th century China. Now, in this talk, I'd like to highlight just a few snapshots, not sort of a full retelling of my book, but just a few snapshots where we can see these two narratives, one promoting a homogeneous Chinese identity, the other promoting a more heterogeneous one, come into sort of like directly speak to one another. Right? So my first snapshot will focus on arguments concerning the role of Fangyan in the construction of the Chinese national language. In particular, I contend that the arguments over the pronunciation of a standard Chinese language bring into sharp relief deep entrenched disagreements about how language should represent a national culture, disagreements that would resonate through the rest of the century. Moving from politics in the early Republican period to the academy, the second snapshot will look at the emergence of the intertwined fields of folksong studies and dialectology after the 1919 May 4th movement. This section will argue that these two disciplines, folksong studies and dialectology, suggested two distinct roles for Fangyan in China's national reinvention. I'll then jump to the height of the Maoist period, exploring the effects of the 1958 Great Leap Forward on language reform. During this period, official rhetoric tied speaking Putonghua to revolutionary fervor, while relegating Fangyan to being remnants of the past, sometimes remnants of like a backwards past. Yet the radical nature of the rhetoric that came out of this policy had unintended consequences. Not only were these proclamations about speaking Putonghua means doing revolution limited in their efficacy, as Fangyan continued to serve as languages of everyday life, but the revolutionary rhetoric politicized language in an unprecedented way, granting Fangyan a connotation sometimes of political subversiveness. The final snapshot will look at the legacies of these narratives today, focusing just a tiny bit on the last year's protests in Hong Kong. Okay, let's start in the year 1913. The Republic of China, barely 2 years old, was struggling to get its bearings. The Republic had replaced a 300-year-old dynasty, which had slowly crumbled in the face of domestic turmoil and multiple defeats in foreign wars. As revolutionaries turned state builders struggled to take a Chinese nation from dream to reality, they hotly debated what it was that actually made nations powerful. On the topic of language, many of them sort of agreed and converged on one narrative, which is that the absence of a unified national language signaled a nation's vulnerability and potential collapse. Now, the brand new Republic's Ministry of Education took this seriously, and in February of 1913, they called in several dozen delegates to participate in a conference to determine the standard pronunciation of a Chinese national language. Now, I start with this meeting because it's one of the most referred to moments in the history of Chinese language reform. I think, as anybody knows, when you start doing research, you'll have people start to tell you sort of what they know about it, and you'll get sort of common narratives about this. And one of the most common things people like to tell me about this research project is about this conference. It comes up a lot, right? Partly because it's the source of a lot of myths. People from Guangzhou, where I did some of my archival work, for instance, love to tell me or love to lament that their own mother tongue lost the status of national language by only a handful of votes. Sometimes it's like by 2 votes, yeah. Perhaps the most persistent part of this meeting's lore is that it was the moment where Beijing, the capital, won, quote unquote, the battle to become the national language. Now, there's some truth to these stories, right? There was something akin to sort of people coming together and trying to come to a consensus on something. I don't know if vote is the right word, but something like that, right? And eventually, though years after this conference, Beijing's language would be chosen to serve as the basis of the national language. But the actual narrative of how Beijing, you know, again, to use this quotes, won is far more complex than this retelling suggests. Rather, I show that the history of this conference shows us that in the early years of the Chinese Republic, a lot of people were less interested in asking which Fangyan do we choose to be the standard, and instead they were more interested in asking what does it mean for a language to represent a nation. Now, one of the men during this period who articulated this thinking really clearly was this man, Zhang Binling. Zhang is something of an enigma to contemporary scholars. He's not really conservative, he's not really a reformer, and he's not really a radical, but somehow he's kind of all three, right? Among the reasons, however, that he was so famous was because he popularized the idea that China's new nation had to be of and for ethnic Han Chinese people, not the Manchurian ruling class of China's Qing dynasty, who he very much portrayed as racially inferior. One of the places he forcefully argued this was in this work, New Dialect, or Xin Fangyan. Published in 1907. It was from 1907 to 1910, sort of over the course of a few years. It was a collection of articles meant to show the origins of a Chinese language by tracing the etymology of several hundred phrases, words, sort of compounds back a couple of thousand years. But Zhang's real goal here, as he sort of articulates, is that he wanted to prove that all Fangyan had a shared core. That he, and this is sort of my metaphor, but I think it works, that they were somehow like time capsules within which lay a unified Han Chinese past. Relatedly, he sought to prove his contention that while all Fangyan had a connection to this shared core, there were some that preserved that shared core better than others. And this work directly informed Zhang's prescriptions for a Chinese national language. Okay. He believed that it should be a newly constructed language that embodied the historical pith of the country's diverse Fangyan. Such a construction, of course, needed a base language upon which it would be built. And guided by his anti-Manchu politics, he opposed Beijing Fangyan as that base, arguing that Northern Fangyan were no longer purely Chinese, that they had been contaminated by centuries of contact with Northern non-Han groups. Instead, he suggested that the Chinese national language be based loosely off of the language spoken in the center of China, which he thought sort of epitomized what he called the language of the states of Chu and Han. Now, after 1911, proposals like Zhang seemed quite attuned to the needs of the new nation, as many saw the capital as too closely tied to the fallen Qing dynasty. His ideas attracted prominent supporters, including many members of that February 1913 conference. And after a rather contentious meeting, they eventually came up with a language that was, in some ways, sort of like at least echoes Zhang's ideas. It was a language that was 80 to 90% similar to the phonology of Beijing, so that's not really Zhang's ideas, right? But it was still a constructed language, with the remaining 10 to 20% of its phonology comprised of characteristics taken from other Fangyan. In particular, one that members of this conference really pushed was the inclusion of a stop ending, or in Chinese we called it the rusheng, right, which is more common in southern languages than northern ones. So I want to draw attention to this episode because it shows that many of the first constructors of the Chinese national language believed that no one Fangyan in particular had the ability to represent the nation in its entirety. Rather, a language that at once represented the nation's present while also embodying its shared ethnic past had to be an amalgam that they themselves either constructed or reconstructed, depending on sort of who you're asking. And this is why Fangyan were so important, because these men's visions of the national standard was one that represented the diverse Han ethno-racial identity in its entirety. It had to account for all of China's Fangyan. Fangyan were not branches or subsidiary versions of a monolithic Chineseness. They were rather pieces of a puzzle, without which the full picture of the Chinese nation remained woefully incomplete. And so in 1913, we have our first Chinese national language, a new invention for a new nation. But after a few years, this 1913 national language, seemingly born of compromise, pleased few people. Those who had been tasked with the practical work of promulgating it saw its shortcomings, casting doubt on the feasibility of enforcing a language that had very few, if any, native speakers. Articles mocked it as blue-green Mandarin, neither donkey nor horse. And even those who really believed in this bold experiment in language creation began to, over sort of the course of the 1910s, doubt its practicality. Take, for instance, this man, Chao Yuen Ren, the father of Chinese linguistics, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. So Zhao was a graduate of Cornell and Harvard, and he was so committed to this hybridized national language that he made a recording of it in 1921. But by 1924, in letters, and he wrote like a green book to his friends and families, where he quietly sort of said that the national language should be pure Beijing Fangyan. And this led him in 1925 to join several other reformers to formally propose Beijing's language as the national standard. Later in life, he explained that while he still thought, part of him thought this was possible, right? But that ultimately he had decided that it wasn't going to succeed because it was impossible to promulgate. Reflecting on this experience, he laughed, "For 13 years, I was the sole speaker of this idiolect, meant to be the national language of 4, 5, or 600 million speakers." And so, in 1925, the language of Beijing was made the national language, and the dream of this hybrid national language sort of faded away. Nonetheless, I tell this story to highlight that for a couple of decades, one of the most prominent visions of the Chinese national language was an invented one that encapsulated China's shared cultural core. And once reformers abandoned their idealized language in favor of simply making Beijing's language their national, sort of the national pronunciation, the unrealized dreams of earlier proposals did not simply disappear. These dreams reemerged in new contexts, repurposed to advance Fangyan as a more historic and pure cultural representative of the Chinese nation. And they would reemerge quite quickly. In 1919, 6 years after the first Chinese national language had been determined and 6 years before it would be replaced, the country erupted into cultural revolution. The May 4th movement, a protest against Japan's acquisition of Germany's colonies in China, dovetailed with ongoing calls from educated elites for a complete upheaval of China's core cultural institutions and intellectual frameworks. In the midst of this movement, academics, inspired by May 4th praise for scientific inquiry, began to eagerly develop new university programs meant to create modern empirical knowledge about the country, its landscape, and its people. Two of these fields of study in particular, Folksong studies and dialectology, were pivotal for reimagining the importance of Fangyan in China's national reinvention. I just want to take a moment to talk about both. Let's begin with the Folksong collection movement, first imagined by this man, Liu Banong, or Liu Fu. Born in Jiangsu, Liu discovered a passion for literature at an early age. He spent his days reading popular fiction, translating the mysteries of Sherlock Holmes, and composing poetry. Like a growing number of intellectuals in China's cities, Liu saw China's outdated language as he saw it as outdated, and he saw that the fact that it was outdated as emblematic of national backwardness. And then he maintained that the country's best artistic expressions existed beyond elite written traditions. In particular, he talked about what he called low-grade fiction, inspired by the everyday artistic productions of China's non-elite. Liu's enchantment with folk culture was matched by that of this man, Chao Yuen Ren, who would eventually help Liu co-found his movement. Zhou traveled to Japan to study in 1906, where he translated Greek mythology, studied Japanese ghost stories, and jotted down saucy jokes from rural towns in China. He also wrote essays analyzing these tales and anecdotes, framing his analysis with ethnographic theory from Europe and the United States. What brought these two men together, one focused on low-grade literature, the other on ethnography, was they both felt strongly that folk songs were critical to the making of a new Chinese national culture in keeping with sort of the May 4th ideas. Their passion led them in 1922 to found a publication called Folksong's Weekly, dedicated to collecting and publishing folk songs from across China. In its pages, they explained how folk songs checked all the boxes of a newly defined modern Chinese culture. Folk songs were vernacular, made for and consumed by the masses. They violated the strict rules of elite poetry rather than imitating those rules. But perhaps most importantly, they represented the ineffable authenticity of everyday life, right? And you'll hear sort of contributors to this periodical talk about how they're spontaneous and they're emotional and there's something very raw and real about them. So they were, in a word, what the Chinese citizenry, what the people actually authentically sounded like. And relevant to this lecture, all, if not almost all of them, so the contributors said, would often say like all of them were sung in Fangyan. This had an important implication for the meaning of what Fangyan were in China. If folk songs were what the Chinese citizenry authentically sounded like, then Fangyan was the medium through which that authenticity was expressed. On the pages of Folksong's Weekly, several contributors began to argue that Fangyan were such a critical part of understanding China's literature, history, and language that they needed to have their own discipline. But many of those dedicated to this discipline had a very specific image of what that discipline would look like. In particular, they thought it needed to be informed by the methodologies of comparative linguistics. As professor of English Lin Yutang explained in 1925, there should be no confusion as to the definition of Fangyan. Language families are divided into Yuyan, languages, and he provided that translation himself, right? The rest of this is in Chinese, but the ones in brackets were English that he provided himself. And within each language, there are divisions of Fangyan or dialects. We ought to declare that when we speak of Fangyan today, that we are using it with the meaning from modern linguistics. Now, what Lin is saying here is that any study of Chinese Fangyan needed to graft onto the models prescribed by scholars of linguistics in Europe and the United States. And that meant that their methodologies needed to presume that Chinese languages related to one another something like this, right? This is a 19th century model, but I think it visually really captures what they're sort of looking at here. And so you'll notice that, as Lin explained, right, like language families turn into languages, and stemming from languages are dialects. So this also says dialect, 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 right? And so essentially dialects stem from or evolve from languages. And for Lin, the only proper way to study Fangyan was to treat them as variants of a larger language, that they evolve from this larger language. Now, a research model to study Fangyan as though they were dialects was first developed and executed by the aforementioned Chao Yuen Ren. After working on China's language reform in the 1920s, he published China's first full-length Fangyan survey titled Study on the Modern Wu Dialect in 1928. For his study, he asked representatives from 32 different localities in the Jiangnan area near Shanghai to pronounce a list of over 3,000 characters. Using wax cylinder phonographs to record sounds, he isolated each character's initial or that beginning consonant, the final, the subsequent vowel or vowel consonant combination, right? And the tone or the intonation with which it is spoken. Zhao then arranged his data into comparative charts that juxtapose the relative pronunciation of each phoneme with the same phoneme from other surveyed areas. Now, Zhao fashioned himself a scientist, and he believed that any scientific methodology meant collecting quantifiable data sets, relying upon empirical observation, and using replicable methodologies. And Zhao's model here fit the bill. Since his phonological data was derived from a predetermined set of characters, Zhao could compare the phonology of several different Fangyans side by side. So here's sort of a break down that big giant chart a little bit, right? These charts create a unified field of comparison whereby the distance among and between Fangyan could be measured based upon how many of these initials and finals differed from one another and in what way. Yet in order to be sort of truly objective in this comparison, Zhao needed a constant or like a reference point to which to compare his data. He gave a bunch of them, which you can see up here. One of the ones that I find really fascinating is that he created what he called sort of like, he explained, it says contemporary Wu Fangyan phonology, but he explains in his introduction that this is kind of like, it's basically an amalgamation of all of these phonetic systems of the places that he's studying into one abstract system, right? So that's sort of how he explains it. But he also includes two others. He includes ancient phonetics, which are based on reconstructions of ancient Chinese, and the phonology of the national language. Now, Zhao chose these constants to both contextualize all his data and to provide a reference point for his readers. But paired with the model of linguistic taxonomies, the use of constants, right, the use of reference languages has a hierarchical implication. Their use rested on the assumption that his surveyed Fangyan existed on a lower taxonomic plane, ultimately made legible or made comprehensible through the existence of these other reference languages. And after 1930, the language that scholars used most often, not exclusively, they use ancient phonetics quite often as well, but it's very common to use the phonology of the national language, right? So this included Zhao. This is a chart from his survey of Zhongxiang Fangyan. Where on the left, right, is Zhongxiang Fangyan, whereas on the right, you can see these same initials in the phonology of the national language. Okay. So with little explanation, therefore, Zhao and his colleagues made the phonology of the national language their constant. And this, I argue, had important consequences. Its use as a constant, perhaps unintentionally, like I don't think that this is something that they like directly articulated, but it was nonetheless powerful that it helped to cinch the notion that China's national language, arguably a Fangyan, right, had not just a unique political status, but had a unique scientific status. In a methodology where Fangyan were all compared to the national phonology, it was granted the same status as these other sort of linguistic root constants, thus like sort of indirectly, right, occupying this higher rung on an imagined hierarchy. Now, I bring up these two disciplines because they respectively saw Fangyan as embodying two unique qualities, authentic and subsidiary. For members of the Folksong collection movement like Liu Banong and Zhou Zuoran, it was Fangyan's embodiment of authentic emotion that made them so valuable. For linguists like Chao Yuen Ren, committed to forging a field of Chinese dialectology on a groundwork of scientific principles, Fangyan were data that could be organized on like sort of taxonomic models that could prove Fangyan's subordination to this image of a Chinese language. And while it is difficult to know how much academic work actually matters to the general public, I argue that these understandings for Fangyan filtered down. They filtered down into everyday stories people tell, into entertainment, and most importantly, into education. And that is, to me, made clear if we move ahead a couple of decades to the height of the Maoist period. Now, after the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party wasted little time launching their new language policy. In November of that year, the same year, 1949, they launched an Association of Language Reform in China, which worked tirelessly to standardize the pronunciation, script composition, and romanization system of a Chinese national language. They outlined and announced this retinue of language reform in the 1950s, which included a scaffolded approach to simplifying Chinese characters, the romanization Hanyu pinyin, and a standardized oral language called Putonghua, which is defined like this: Beijing's pronunciation as standard pronunciation, Northern dialect as base dialect, and modern vernacular literature as standard structure, vocabulary, and grammar. Now, there's a notable amount of continuity between these official PRC standards and language policies before 1949, right? We have romanization systems before 1949. Like a lot of the simplified character schemas have precedent in earlier sort of like common simplified characters. And that really, if we sort of look at this, Putonghua differs more from the national language of the Republic of China in its definition than in its phonology. And despite the fact that the PRC's vision of the Chinese nation was one built on and strengthened through Marxist-Leninist principles, the tension we saw before 1949 between pushing for one national language as representative and celebrating linguistic diversity also characterized the early years of the PRC. And indeed, for the PRC's first decade or so, these two narratives coexisted side by side. Though multiple arms of the CCP's bureaucracy worked hard to promote Putonghua as the nation's common language, in particular in the classroom, right? Official language instructed new teachers to emphasize that Putonghua promulgation was not meant to be at Fangyan's expense. At the same time, Fangyan were celebrated in other areas of official life. One example I talk about in the book is theater, right? Where traveling drama troupes performed revolutionary plays in local languages. There was even sort of an exhibition of these plays in Beijing. So there was support for this, right? The idea that these plays should be in local languages. But official tolerance for this coexistence really shifted in official rhetoric in 1958. That year was the rollout of the Great Leap Forward, a sweeping economic policy meant to demonstrate people's superhuman endeavors in economic production and cultural rejuvenation. The Great Leap Forward spirit was first and foremost applied to grain and steel production, with the central government calling upon its citizens to double or quadruple grain production or catch up with Britain in terms of steel production and these kinds of goals. But the movement's rhetoric imbued almost all areas of life, including national language promulgation. For instance, there was one of the ways that we get a lot of this rhetoric is that there were a lot of these events called Teaching Putonghua Achievement Exhibitions. So a lot of them were in Shanghai, but they were kind of all over the country. And there were local ones and national ones that were held annually, but they were meant to showcase successes in language promulgation. So a speech at one of them exclaimed, "There are those who believe when the Liberation Army is at our defense, can it be considered doing revolution? Or they say that developing oil fields is doing revolution. But as for promulgating Putonghua for the revolution, is it placing its value too high? It's not. In this age of our great revolution, in this country of our great revolution, on every front, whether it's a large-scale movement or everyday activities, it is all part of revolutionary work." So the Great Leap Forward rhetoric, in other words, equated speaking Putonghua with other nation-building efforts like developing oil fields or even winning wars. What goes unstated, however, is that if speaking Putonghua both represented and facilitated doing revolution, within the fervor of the Great Leap Forward, then not speaking the national language could potentially amount to not supporting the revolution's goals. These grand pronouncements and official rhetoric painted the issue as black and white, right? Speak the national language and join the revolution. And then what goes unstated is if you don't, then you don't. Sometimes that wasn't unstated, right? Sometimes that was very clearly articulated. But if these policies were actually applied like their rhetoric suggested and they were meeting their goals here that were articulated in these official documents, Putonghua would theoretically be universally, maybe even sort of like most commonly spoken throughout China, which we know isn't true, right? Or singularly spoken throughout China, which we know is not true. In a lot of areas of China, Putonghua can sometimes be rare. And in big cities like Guangzhou and Shanghai, the sounds in the streets are often a cacophony of multiple Fangyan, Putonghua, English, and a code-switching mixture of all of them. right? And a lot of things that are kind of in between. These easily observable realities remind us that the implementation of language reform nearly half a century ago, that there's a significant gap between rhetoric and practice. So if we are to presume that the present can tell us something about the past, how do we explain this gap? I think we can start by talking about where Fangyan likely continued to be spoken through the Mao, through the PRC under Mao. First, Fangyan very likely lived in the private home, right? That's where people spoke Fangyan with one another in the home. Not only did I sort of get this from just talking to people, right? But even sometimes this came up in official rhetoric of officials complaining about the fact that kids would go home and speak Fangyan with their families rather than practicing Putonghua. So from a 1973, one of these conferences they raise as sort of a potential problem, and they say we should be encouraging children to practice Putonghua in the home. Okay. Similarly, interviews I did with people who grew up during this period confirmed that in the classrooms that they grew up in, a lot of these pronouncements often went ignored. Sometimes teachers just found Putonghua too difficult to learn. Or maybe they'd enforce it in like Chinese language class, but not in say like science or math, right? And finally, we should note that official rhetoric often presented the situation as though there was a very thick line between Putonghua on the one hand and Fangyan on the other. And that's just not how languages behave, right? People might and did just learn, say, a few conversational phrases in Putonghua, or learn some Putonghua, or learn it with like a thick accent, or even sort of invent new amalgamations altogether that melded Fangyan with Putonghua. So while I was doing archival work, this project, I spent some time in Qingdao, and I spent some time with a linguist there who explained to me that very few people speak what he called pure Qingdaohua or Qingdaoese. And he said that sort of like from people who like lived from the like 30s through the 50s were the people who spoke this pure Qingdaohua. But once you started to see the rollout of Putonghua promulgation programs in the 50s and 60s, people adapted to speaking what he called Qingpu, right? Or which is like Qingdaoese-ified Putonghua, or sometimes also called Puqing, which is like Putonghua-ified Qingdaohua. So just these sort of like amalgamations, right? So in other words, this do revolution rhetoric was primarily rhetoric that did not seem to at least universally be matched entirely by action. But I don't think that makes the rhetoric unimportant. Rather, by imbuing language reform with the vocabulary and spirit of mass political movements, the connotations of linguistic choices shifted. Awarded an entire new set of significances, Fangyan were made antithetical to Putonghua and what it stood for, nation and revolution and loyalty to the party. By directly tying language choices to political loyalty, this rhetoric intentionally, or maybe unintentionally, politicized language speaking as it related to national identity. And that brings us to today. So as I follow current events, I see the relevance of these narratives about Fangyan pop up everywhere, right? From stories about rappers in Sichuan to reports about rapidly changing Chinese media laws and censorship of apps, or even new directions in Chinese academia. But to me, just to sort of wrap up this talk, one of the most poignant ways we can see the significance of the history I presented today is through protest movements that directly reference the importance of Fangyan to collective identity. And so just to sort of end, I want to take a quick glance at just two examples. One comes from the city of Guangzhou in 2010, where a protest gathered in response to a decision by the municipal government to increase television offerings in Putonghua, thereby potentially reducing its programming in Cantonese. In July of that year, protesters gathered in Guangzhou's People's Park, adorned in t-shirts proclaiming "Sing praises for Guangzhou," where they spontaneously broke into verses of canto pop songs from the Hong Kong room beyond. This picture here shows a man at the protest, his sign reading, "I love Cantonese, I don't speak stewed winter melon." So I want to draw attention to a couple elements of this sign. The first is the use of the term stewed winter melon, a sort of derogatory slang, or not derogatory, but slang for Putonghua because it's homophonous in Cantonese. The second, however, is that the heart of his "I love Cantonese" is in fact the flag of the People's Republic of China. So he's appealing to patriotism here. And I think appealing to patriotism and speaking Fangyan reminds us of how in the early 20th century, or since the early 20th century, Chineseness was believed to include this linguistic diversity. That because Fangyan had this connection to the past, that because they were authentic representations of what people actually spoke, diversity could be patriotic. This protester, in other words, took the political implications of language speaking and flipped the script, reclaiming Chinese identity for Cantonese. And to bring our talk full circle and return back to Hong Kong, the idea that Fangyan is a way to reclaim Chinese identity from a hegemonic homogenous standard is deeply relevant to current events in that city. Last year, a massive protest movement in opposition to an extradition bill between Hong Kong Special Administrative Region and China and the People's Republic. So this erupted in June of 2019, right, which subsequently grew into this broader movement that spoke against the erosion of Hong Kong's economic, political, and cultural independence, and in support of its unique identity apart from the mainland. Within this protest movement, Cantonese has become, as one professor put it, the language of protest. To get a sense of how important Cantonese to the spirit of the protest movement, there's a lot of examples I could bring in, but I wanted to show a series of images because I think that they capture it, that were widely circulated on Facebook, all of which, the point of which was to show how Hong Kong differs from the rest of China. So I want to say these are memes, okay? So have that in your expectations, that this is a meme, okay? So the idea like here is that there's like a series of like 25 images, all of which say Hong Kong is not China. So some of the examples they give of how they're different are political, right? So this particular example here is meant to show that in the PRC, right, it's difficult to talk publicly about the June 4th massacre at Tiananmen, in Tiananmen Square in 1989. So like 6 and 4 are censored. Obviously that's not what keyboards look like, but that's what they're referencing here. Whereas in Hong Kong, up until recently, right, that there was freedom of expression is protected. But some of like the images that they show here highlight cultural difference, including this one about language. Okay, so this has bad words on it. So I'm just gonna censor those out. And instead sort of highlight what they say at the bottom here, which is Chinese speak Mandarin, which has a 4-tone system in more than 100 years of history, whereas Hong Kongers speak Cantonese, which has a 9-tone system with 2,000 years of history. To me, this image is striking in how it evokes the arguments made by Zhang Bingling over a century ago, which saw some Fangyan as more authentically connected to sort of ancient Chinese-ness, right, than others. The image here implies that Hong Kongers are seeking to not only carve out their own identity, they are seeking to sever the bonds between Putonghua and Chinese identity and reclaim Chinese collective identity from Beijing. And that ultimately is sort of the core of my book. By writing a history of Chinese nationalism centered on Fangyan, I argued that the standardized symbols of a homogeneous identity, a national language, a national song, a national dish, often hold significance, but they're not the be-all and end-all of a national culture. Right? Rather, nationalism is defined by how different people understood, tethered themselves to, and excluded others from the nation. For some, that nation is, was, and must be homogeneous. Others imagined it in heterogeneous, multitudinous expressions. The existence of these two narratives shows that Chinese nationalism neither forced nor required linguistic conformity, and indeed that nationalism thrived and still thrives in opposition to forces of homogenization. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Quite the whirlwind tour through 100 years there. We're already getting, I think, some really great questions in, but I'm going to abuse my privilege and ask the first one, which sort of takes us back to, I guess, the early decades of the Republic. And I was wondering, to what extent do your interlocutors, sort of people like Chao Yuen Ren, Lin Yutang, and so on, what is their sense of the Romanization sort of debate? And I'm asking this with sort of the question that's lurking in the back of my mind is really, is there a sense that there is a distinction between languages that are ideographic, that are character-based, and then languages that are phonetic, and that it presents, you know, because you have Romanization, you have an attempt to also, you know, sort of the precursors to pinyin in some ways, simplify Fantiza and so on. So is there a recognition of a certain kind of difference between phonetic and ideographic languages? And what role do they see Romanization possibly playing in the creation of the national language versus the identification of Fangyan?
So that's a great question. Can I? Yeah, okay. I'll stick with Chao Yuen Ren because I think that his example is sort of really fascinating. So all of these guys, they almost sort of all agreed that there needed to be some sort of phonetic system, primarily for teaching language, right? That's how you needed to teach it. So Chao Yuen Ren made these phonographs, but he's like, they had an accompanying textbook because he realized that there needed to be a way to render sort of the phonology of any sort of language, right? And you'll notice that a lot of them use the International Phonetic Alphabet in their surveys. As far as whether they should get rid of characters, like there was not a lot of agreement on that. Like some really sort of forcefully argued that, and whereas others were just like these can be concurrent. But as far as sort of like what role Romanization had to play, so Chao Yuen Ren actually invented his own system called Guoyu Luomazi, and his idea here was that any system that rendered Chinese phonetically needed to be very precise. And therefore needed to render tones. And I am positive that I will spell it wrong if I try to do it off the top of my head. But it involves sort of adding extra letters like Y's and Z's and H's or double vowels, right, in order to get across different tones. And his idea, so Chao Yuen Ren, when he thought about what language should be, he really saw it as like you could engineer a scientifically ideal language that is perfect for teaching, right? And so when he was thinking about sort of what the national language should be, he's like, we should engineer a language that is the easiest for everyone to learn. And he thought of Romanization systems in that way as well. Others created other ones, right? There was a big attention paid to the idea that one of the reasons that it needed to be Roman letters as opposed to others, not everyone agreed on this, but a lot of them did, because that way it was easy to sort of like, it was easier for like people from Europe and the United States to learn Chinese, right? So there was that sense of it as well. But as far as sort of like how characters fit into this, right? I think a lot of them articulated arguments that were being made by missionaries and such that like Chinese characters were much harder to learn than like a phonological script. And so some of them were rather dismissive of characters, but others sort of said like getting rid of them altogether is kind of a nightmare. There was also a fear that getting rid of them, so like others argued that if we just got rid of them entirely and just use, say, Guoyu Luomazi, that we would end up losing Fangyan, right? That essentially they were incompatible with that, and characters were phonetically flexible enough to accommodate all of these different diverse Fangyan. So there was an attention paid to that as well. So I think that is sort of how a lot of these guys were thinking about that.
Great, thank you. So we have a whole host of questions now.
Yay.
I think in the interest of fairness, we'll just sort of go through them sequentially. But as you answer, I'll also try and see if we can find sort of ones that overlap so we can ask them together. But the first one is from Eric Derole. I hope I pronounced that name somewhat correctly. This may be a tangential question, but do you have a sense for the attitudes of Chinese diaspora communities, for example, in North America and Southeast Asia, towards the push for Putonghua in mainland China and Hong Kong?
Oh, that's such a great question. And my sort of sense of this, it is a little bit outside of my research area, but it's something that sort of comes up a lot. And I'll give two examples that show that I think that these two narratives, I think, also exist among diasporic communities, right? So there are a lot of places where like sort of like Chinese overseas in, say, North America and such, that they never learned Putonghua, right? That they were sort of learning Cantonese, and Fujianese was very, very common, right? And that these were sort of really significant to them, right? And so there is sort of these efforts to kind of preserve these Fangyan outside and think about that as sort of a Chinese language. On the other hand, I'll sort of bring up Singapore because in the 1980s, there was this push to speak Mandarin, right? It was like a Speak Mandarin campaign in the 1980s in Singapore that really emphasized that Chinese was Putonghua, right? Those were equivalent, right? And you even have rhetoric saying that like it's the real Chinese, which is sort of I think echoing the same rhetoric that we get in mainland China, right? As far as what they think about what's happening in Hong Kong and sort of China, right? I'll often hear sort of like, I'm speaking anecdotally here, but I'll often hear both of these narratives, right? That like it makes sense for a country to have a national language, right? Whereas in particular, sort of the emotional connection in Hong Kong towards Cantonese, right? Like I know a professor here who's from Hong Kong who very strongly feels about Cantonese, that it is sort of this real historic Chinese language. And so I think that we can see both of these narratives here, if that makes sense. I know that feels like kind of like a cop-out, but those are the examples that I can think of off the top of my head.
No, that's great. I see a few questions that sort of are that touch upon sort of the same set of issues. So maybe I'll just read them out together,
Sure.
and then you can address them as opposed to sort of repeating sort of some of the content at least. So the first of those three is from an anonymous attendee who says, "Thank you very much for this enthralling discussion, Professor Tam. This is such an interesting and important topic. As a second-year MA student from Johns Hopkins SAIS, I'm very interested in language policy, language minorities, and in particular, ethnic language minorities. It looks like we are seeing a resurgence in assimilationist policies targeted toward Chinese minority ethnic groups today, presumably. For example, the recent policies in Inner Mongolia. Could you speak a little bit more about this? Thank you." So that's the, so linking it to nationalism and sort of assimilation. Then there's a related question from James Watson Cripps, who says, "Thank you for the great talk. It's been extremely interesting seeing the vicissitudes of language and the politics thereof. My question, however, is about the relationship between language and ethnicity, and by extension, identity. In your research, do you find any variance in how these language reforms were implemented among Han, which appears to be the main subject of your talk, and language reform education among minority groups? And how does this then relate to identity politics and hierarchies?" And then the third one is, I made a note of the names here, is someone called Stephen Zhu. Stephen Zhu, a graduate student at Duke. What is the influence of Mandarin promulgation on ethnic groups who seldom speak Chinese? So these are variations of, I think, a broader set of questions that have a lot in common. So maybe, yeah, you can feel free to take them whichever, however you want to answer them.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to take the second one first, and then sort of address the other two, and highlight that there is some absolutely excellent work being done on in particular, sort of language policies among ethnic minorities. Gerald Roche, who's in Australia, does a lot of stuff on Tibetan language policy. Sort of thinking off the top of my head, there was a great one that came out about Mongolian, whose name I'm just absolutely blanking on. I apologize, but there's some great work being done for people who actually speak these other languages. Which I don't, right? So what is the relationship between sort of nation and ethnicity? What is such a great question. And one of the things I found is that a lot of the people, not exclusively, but there's a theme here of people who are arguing that like Fangyan are more historic, more pure. This sort of like Cantonese has 2,000 years of history. Narratives often come as sort of reclaiming what is essentially an ethnic purity image of what Chineseness is, right? This idea that like there's one of the things I heard a lot about is, right, Cantonese is the language of the tongue poets, right? Whereas Northern languages had been like adulterated or had been mixed with Northern non-Han groups. So what I find is that a lot of these narratives, not all of them, right, but a lot of them of this idea of like Chineseness can be diverse, were built upon the idea that there is still sort of like they are circumscribing an ethnic identity, right? That we need to celebrate the Han ethno-racial identity in its entirety, which includes all these Fangyan, but that in fact, right, that Fangyan are Han Chinese, right? Like that is the distinction here. And I'll give one sort of fascinating example that happens in the 1920s and 30s is that, so like in the early 1900s, there are these native place association textbooks and local gazetteers, in particular in the province of Guangdong, that start calling Hakka, right, Kejia people, outsiders or outside Zhu, like outside ethnicities. And Hakka in particular overseas really took like offense to this, right? That they are like, absolutely not. We are not an outside Zhu. We are more Chinese than you guys are. And one of the sort of like you get this flurry of scholarship on the history of the Hakka, a lot of which is geared very strongly towards proving that Hakka are actually more Chinese because their Fangyan is more closely related to like the historic center of China, and they actually moved southward, right, later than the local Cantonese, right? They moved in the narrative of sort of the Song dynasty and the Ming dynasty is when Hakka moved into the southern areas, and that when they moved down to these areas, they became so they carried that sort of historic heartland better than the Southerners. Sometimes you'll even get these kind of sort of ethno-nationalist narratives that like Cantonese and Fujianese have mixed with Vietnamese or mixed with like Dai and Thai, and therefore are again not purely Chinese. So there is sort of like this ethnic purity narrative that comes here. So what does that mean for ethnic minorities? And again, I will say that for those who are interested, I really highly recommend that you read these other works by these other scholars, because there's some really great stuff. But essentially, I think what we're seeing is what I think that sort of what we see in common between what's happening in among sort of Han groups who speak Fangyan and among ethnic minorities is that what's common is that there's an assimilationist kind of narrative here, right? That Putonghua is the Chinese language, right? And that is what we learn to be a part of the Chinese nation, right? But I find that the sort of idea of like how we think about what Fangyan are there's, I think, a fear in policymaking among, in particular, Inner Mongolia is a really good example of this, Tibet, in Xinjiang, among sort of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, that not speaking Chinese in some ways sort of like denotes separatism, right? Or like a desire to not be a part of the Chinese nation, right? Whereas you get that a little bit in Hong Kong. Like I'll see some of that rhetoric in Hong Kong about Cantonese, that like your Chinese speak Putonghua, right? That's sort of what's happening here. But with sort of ethnic minorities, you're seeing an enormous more amount of sort of like suppressing kind of ethnic culture. So they're tied with these other policies that doesn't really make sense when we're talking about, say, like Cantonese and such, right? So I think that is a sort of distinction there. But yeah, these are great questions. Thanks.
Yeah, no, we're getting great questions. I'm trying my best to try and group them together so that we can try and cover as much ground as possible.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna shift focus a little bit and take two questions that sort of situate this in a more international comparative context. So the first question is by Ares Manella, who teaches here in the history department at Harvard, who says, a great talk. My question: whether linguists and others debating these questions in the 20th century, making references or comparisons to other movements to create national languages, and then he cites France, Italy, and Germany as possible examples. And if so, did they consider any of them as a model for the Chinese case? So that's Ares. And then there's someone called Panga who says, do so many kinds of dialects exist in other countries? Can you explain how other countries treat dialects? So
yes.
Question again.
So I'll start with the first question. Absolutely, that they were sort of like making comparisons. France comes up a lot, but the one that comes up by far the most is Japan. And that is one of the things, so, sort of the sake of time, I was trying to sort of streamline this narrative, but there were people in sort of the early 20th century in the 1910s who were arguing that Beijing should be the national language. And the reason was that that's what Japan did. Japan chose the capital as their sort of standard language, and China should do the same, right? And even the idea of linguistic conferences, right? The idea of a conference coming together to choose a national language is something that sort of like these academics are borrowing from, right? So they're thinking about that in a very similar way. So that is, I actually, when I gave a talk on this, I had a really phenomenal conversation with somebody who was like, why are they looking at Japan? Japan isn't like China. That's a weird comparison. And I'm like, I don't disagree with you, but that's who they were citing, right? Like that they were thinking about Japan and why Japan was different. But in particular, sort of, I'll give a shout out to Jeff Wong, who wrote an article specifically about how it's like this idea of creating a new language is not entirely unprecedented. Like these guys were really interested in Esperanto, which was sort of happening at the same time, or at least some of these guys were interested in Esperanto. So it's not entirely out of the norm of the idea of creating a new language, but it's pretty unique, right? This idea of that you can sort of manufacture languages to best serve nation building goals. Whether that nation building goal is for Chao Yuen Ren, it was like, what is the most efficient way we can promulgate? Like, let's scientifically engineer a language to be very easily promulgatable. To those who are like, we can engineer something that represents who we are as a people, right? And so that to me is sort of a really fascinating corollary. Is there linguistic diversity like this in other countries? Yes, but I do sort of want to stress how different these Fangyan are in China, right? So dialects are often a misnomer. There are a lot of linguists and linguistic anthropologists and sociologists who really don't like this translation, right, of Fangyan to dialect, who argue that essentially it's just wrong. In my book, I don't come down on that. simply because, not because I don't have an opinion about it, but because I see my work as a historian is, rather than arguing what's the best translation for Fangyan, it's why are they calling them dialects in the first place? Like, why is that the term that they're using? So that's what I'm sort of interested in. But there really is just an astounding amount of linguistic diversity here. One of the examples that I ended up reading a lot about, and actually sort of one of the first readers of this manuscript focused on this, was South Asia in India, right, where you also have sort of language policies, in particular colonial language policies, happening there, where you have this amount of linguistic diversity. What makes China, again, sort of unique, to go back to Arnab's first question, is the fact that even though we're talking about like oral linguistic diversity, right, Cantonese and Putonghua are really just not mutually intelligible with one another, they use the same script, right? And so there is a unity there that is hard to sort of, I think, replicate in other, that don't have exact historical corollaries elsewhere. So. I hope that helps. But if you're interested, there's an enormous amount of really good work on language policy and this idea of vernacular and dialect and language in India, in colonial India, like in South Asia. Just really great work. Yeah.
Great. I'm gonna, again, another area which I think is more about regionalism. So we were international to look within China at regionalism. I have a couple of questions that look kind of interesting from this perspective. So what Peter Carew asks, what role did economic power of various regions in China play in the debate over the national language pre-1948? Was Shanghainese considered? Then there is, let me see if I can find them quickly, Peter Lee. Peter Lee asks, Cantonese speakers are rightfully proud of their dialect and the cultural traditions of southern China and the legacy of earlier dynasties. Is this shared by other regions that is distinct from Mandarin dialects, or is Cantonese somewhat a special case even within Chinese history? And then a similar question from Elliot. Just a second, I'm scrolling, trying to find it. So Elliot Chung. Hi Gina, Elliot here from Taipei National University of the Arts, so I presume you know him, MA student. I'm in particular curious about how defense of Cantonese in both Guangzhou and Hong Kong interacts with regional pride identity in the Guangdong Lingnan area. Lingnan region vis-a-vis connection to a national or cultural Chineseness. Do we see similar or differing movements happening where shared linguistic groups are divided by national borders? For example, Hokkien dialects between China, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. So there's a Tom Gold question here too, but maybe we can take these three and then we'll go to Tom's question.
Absolutely. Okay. So I'll start with sort of the economic question, which I think leads itself into talking about this. And I'll start with sort of like one of the things that I now that the sort of book is out, I like to sort of talk about things that that I struggled with, right, in thinking about this. And one of the things that I struggled with in writing this book is that I really did want to write a history of how this category of Fangyan was imagined and evolved vis-a-vis national identity. Because of a variety of reasons, which get to like the questions that are sort of highlighted here, Cantonese is talked about just a lot, right? When we're talking about sort of like all primary sources that deal with Fangyan, an enormous amount of it comes from Guangzhou, right? And it comes from Hong Kong and comes from these southern regions, right? And one of the things that's sort of interesting here is that I spent a lot of time going through gazetteers to see if people were talking about sort of Fangyan and linguistic pride before the 20th century. You get a little bit of it in Guangzhou, just a little bit of it, right, in talking about sort of the historic nature of their Fangyan. So to answer that question, is sort of Cantonese unique? Yes, for that reason, I think the fact that Cantonese speakers are sort of quite widely represented in the diaspora also makes them unique. And then there's sort of the fact, to get at this question of economic power, right? There's the fact that like Hong Kong's economic power matters here. So one of the questions I get asked a lot, right, is like, what is the future of Fangyan in China? And I spent a lot of time talking to linguists about this, and they're like basically economic power really matters in terms of like the kind of infrastructure you can create for the preservation of and importance of a Fangyan, right? Or importance of a language, of a dialect, or whatever we want to call it. And I think Cantonese movies, Cantonese radio, Cantonese education, like all of these things, we have this infrastructure for Cantonese that is kind of unparalleled. The ones that come closest, I would argue, are Taiwanese. because of sort of movements towards that in Taiwan after the 1990s. And then another sort of example, Shanghainese has a little bit of this, right? But it is harder to learn Shanghainese than it is to learn Cantonese, right? There's just like I took Cantonese classes, right? And it's a hard time finding Shanghainese classes. And I took Cantonese classes at Stanford, right? So those exist outside of China. And so when we think about sort of like economic power, one of the ways that I had trouble sort of getting around when I was doing this research, but I'm very cognizant of, is that I'm writing this story about Fangyan with the cognizance of that there are certain groups that really have sort of more say in what this discourse is than others, right? And that is a story that I'm trying to tell, right? But I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that that's just sort of the case. As far as who was considered for the national language, to get back to this conference, there were some people who were arguing for particular languages. The most common one was the language of Beijing. Others were arguing for this amalgamation, right? And so the stories of this language often talks about camps, like there's southern camps and northern camps. But there were a lot of people in southern camps who were arguing for the language of Beijing. And there were a lot of people in sort of like northern camps, like they come from northern provinces, who were arguing for this sort of like average of things, right? There were always somebody who was saying like, my Fangyan should be the national language, right? But as far as this conference goes, to me, sort of the major split was between pick the language of the capital or sort of like invent something that really includes and celebrates what is special about Southern Fangyan. And finally, to get to Elia's question, and I'm so honored because it's so early in Taiwan right now, so I'm really honored. But when we think about sort of regional pride, this is something else I thought a lot about, right? Is that the slippage between national pride and regional pride sometimes becomes really fuzzy. So in the epilogue of my book, I talk a little bit about a Shanghainese rapper who talks a lot about Fangyan and what it means to him, and a lot of times it does really feel like regional pride, right? Like he's talking about how like Shanghai food and the streets of Shanghai and preserving Shanghai, but it often sort of, I think, first of all, I think that like regional pride will often extend to national pride, because if we think about sort of like what I spend a lot of time, with my students in Texas talking about sort of what national pride, how they understand it and what it means to them. And it really does sort of start with our personal experiences, right? And I think that to me, there's sort of a slippage there, right? That we very sort of slip easily in and out of these things. As far as sort of Cantonese in Hong Kong, right? This is really sort of, I struggled with how to sort of frame this, because there is a real push, I think, for a unique, separate Hong Kong identity. That is separate from both Chinese nationalism and sometimes even Chinese ethnic identity, right? And so one of the things I found is that I think that there are a lot of narratives here, but a couple of pieces of protest art that really stuck out to me were people from Hong Kong who were sort of trying to reclaim what were, to me, were very clear symbols of Chinese national history. So one of I think I have it. Let's see if I can show it really quickly. Give me just a second. We'll see if I can find it. It'll take me just a moment. Yeah, this is it. Okay, cool. Let's see. Did that work? Can you see that? Yes. So I love that, because this is like Sun Yat-sen, right? Who's the father of the Chinese national, like he's the father of the Chinese nation, right? And here he is decked out in protest garb, right? And so is this the only way that I think people are understanding like sort of like regional versus national identity in Hong Kong? No, I don't think so. But to me, I see a lot of that. And when I speak to people who are from Hong Kong and Guangzhou about sort of what Cantonese means to them, or I read it sort of in public discourse and articles on Twitter, right? There is a real emphasis that like, we're the real Chinese, right? Like Mandarin's really new, it's manufactured, it's connected to Northern non-Han groups. All of these kinds of narratives, I think, shows that there's something else, like regional pride is obviously happening, right? But I think that there's something else that goes beyond that as well.
Great. So just to stay on this theme, because we have another question that you touched upon Taiwan already. So maybe we can talk about. Oh, before I take Tom Gold's question, though, I thought I'd point out you brought up the case of India, and I think it's interesting for if the person who asked it is still listening, that it's been actually extremely divisive as an issue in India, and it's seen actually a lot more violence than it has in China, with especially from states in southern India. But the Constitution, I think it's in the eighth schedule of the Constitution, actually identifies 22 languages that have some kind of official / national status. So there have been different approaches to try and address linguistic diversity.
Yeah.
So Tom has a linked question to the sort of this your response right now to regionalism and regional pride, more focused on Taiwan directly. He asks, Tom Gold, this is, it may be beyond the scope of your project, but what about controversy over the use of Mandarin, Goyu, in Taiwan versus Taiwanese, itself a variant of Mingnanhua, that some people also argue is much older than Mandarin. So I think this has cooled down in the recent years, but it was a central issue in the debate over a distinct Taiwanese identity in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Yes, very much so. And so it's so fascinating. I actually I'm working on like a separate little piece that looks at this particular narrative of like what's the oldest Chinese language. And initially, when I wrote the first draft of this and I presented it, I said, I was focused on Cantonese. Like I wanted to just talk about Cantonese. And when I presented this, all these people in the audience are like, well, I'm from Suzhou and we say our language is the oldest language. Well, I'm from, I speak Fujianese and we say our language is the oldest language. So this idea of like sort of like trying to grasp onto this connection to antiquity is a really fascinating one, and it's common. Taiwan, you're right that Taiwan was a little bit outside the scope of my project, but I do think that there is this sort of fascinating thing happening with Taiwanese in Taiwan, right? Where it is a way, on the one hand, to sort of claim independence, which I think is something that up until very recently was very rare in Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong was not like, it wasn't very mainstream to argue that like Hong Kong is an independent entity, right? Whereas in Taiwan, that's a very different kind of question, right? And so it's a way to sort of like, claim sort of the unique history of Taiwan that separates it from China. But at the same time, right, like I had a language teacher in Taiwan who sort of told me the same thing, right, that there are ancient cultural roots here that we can detect from the southern Fangyan that we cannot detect from northern Fangyan. So I think that both of these narratives exist in Taiwan, right? That there's one of Taiwanese being this story of an entirely separate sort of political and cultural identity from mainland China, whereas Goyu represents the Republic of China, which arguably, right, is a colonial power in Taiwan. Whereas you also, I think, have this connection to sort of like cultural Chineseness that you can see through the sort of like the praise of Taiwanese as a language. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Okay, shifting. We're really working you hard here, but there are so many great.
No,
questions.
That's okay. I'm here for it. I love it.
So there's a whole set of questions surrounding education. So I thought I'll read them out and then you can take them as you will. So the first one, let me see, is so Natalie Bellew, who says, "Thank you so much, Dr. Tam. I am curious about whether you know about efforts of the PRC in Taiwan in perpetuating Putonghua in schools. How did language policy shift on there from the Kuomintang to the CCP? Or perhaps the better question is, how did it differ in China? Finally, do you see similar protests of reclaiming Taiwanese like with Cantonese in Hong Kong?" So that's the first one. It's linked to education, or what's happening in the schools. There's a few more. There is, sorry, I'm trying to scroll through and find them. Louise Wolf, who asks, to what extent do other languages, dialects other than Putonghua exist as teaching languages at universities and colleges in the PRC? So a more factual question, but very relevant again. Then there's a question from Joe Rohan, who says, "Hi, this is Rohan Joe, a graduate student from the University of Chicago. I have also done research relevant to the language reform. The unified language certainly promoted a unified socio-political identity. However, the language reform on the grassroots was carried out in the form of mass education, literacy campaigns in particular, which was an effort going on since the establishment of the PRC. In the early periods of the 1950s, mass education programs were already promoting a unified identity. In this way, for the rural non-elites in the PRC, how did language reform reinforce this identity? So it's the linking language reform and mass education. And then there's one other question, Kate Bryan. Kate Bryan, who says, my name is Kate Bryan. I'm an undergrad at UNC. My question regards educational programs for minority languages. You discussed campaigns of Putonghua as the national Chinese language with corresponding educational materials. Have you found campaigns for teaching of ethnic minority languages as an elective of sorts among Han majority communities? So again, different aspects of the teaching of standard languages.
Yes. Okay. I'll try and go through these one by one. So for Natalie, so the shift in terms of sort of like from the KMT, from the ROC to the PRC, a lot of their policies were very similar in terms of sort of pre-1949 and post-1949. I actually spent a lot of time talking to this linguist in Fujian who was in charge. So he had sort of like learned the national language as a kid in the 30s, and then in the 50s he was one of the people who sort of set up these really quick pop-up like learn Putonghua in a few weeks for teachers, right? Like it was something that happened in the 50s where in particular elementary school teachers were expected to learn Putonghua really fast and then bring it to the classroom. And basically what he said is like, well, I learned the national language in part because of where I lived and as a kid, and in part because of like, I went to a really good school, right? And so to me, that's sort of emblematic of the idea that which also the question about mass education also gets at, right? Like, is that the KMT had these grand ideas about national language promulgation, but like education itself was just less widespread than it was in the PRC, where they really mobilized a lot to get sort of mass education movements on the ground. The KMT also, towards the 30s, started to be a little bit stricter on things like censorship, which was also true in Taiwan after 1949. So like in the 1930s, they tried to ban Cantonese movies, and there was this big flurry of things, and like it wasn't really successful. A lot, like there were some Cantonese filmmakers who protested in like sort of newspapers or like this is a poorly thought out ban. Others just didn't send their movies into the censorship board, right? They just banned Cantonese movies anyway. And so there was like a real, and this is, you know, sort of a theme of pre-1949 KMT is they're dealing with a lot of stuff, right? And so there's sort of limited efficacy here in terms of that. So that to me, I know a little bit less about like Mandarin or Goyu education in Taiwan after 1949. My vague understanding of it is that there were just harsher punishments for not speaking Goyu than there were in mainland China, where again, like there's this rhetoric of revolutionary politics, but they made a big deal about the fact that they weren't punishing people for speaking Fangyan, and it was difficult to enforce this stuff, right? And so I think that's sort of a difference there too. Look at my notes here. Other languages and teaching languages in the PRC. So my understanding, and again, I sort of defer to people who have written really extensively about this, but there are like Tibetan language learning materials. There are Mongolian language learning materials. Oftentimes, my understanding is that it's either after primary school or after secondary school, these languages become electives for people who live in those provinces, right? So Mongolian and Uyghur and Tibetan become electives. I'm fairly certain that's true in Xinjiang. I know a little bit less off the top of my head about Mongolian. So these infrastructures do exist, right? One of the things that I think is really fascinating, right, is that the idea of like, what is Tibetan? We have a similar question of sort of like, what is Chinese? Because there are a lot of Tibetan languages, right, that are widely diverse, right? And so there is like one Tibetan language that is often upheld as the Tibetan language when that's not necessarily what everybody speaks, right? But if you were to sort of take it as an elective or learn it early on in school, that is likely what you would learn is this one Tibetan language, right? There's also, we have to sort of note here that even if these exist, that doesn't mean that there is support or a lack of pressure when it comes to sort of learning these languages, right? And so there's a lot of economic incentive to not, right, continue to study these languages, right? And there's a lot of political pressure as well, I love the question about mass education and literacy campaigns. So this is really fascinating. And since the question asker said that this is something that they're themselves researching, I'll sort of add on to what I think is really fascinating, which is to get back to my question of sort of rhetoric versus reality. And I'll give one particular example. So this has less to do with education than it does with mass movements, but I think it sort of relates here. Which is that, so I spoke with a professor that I used to have who was a sent down youth during the Cultural Revolution. And like the official documents that I have in front of me are basically like, teach Putonghua, speak Putonghua, right? It's the language of the nation. That's what we do. But that like local cadres told him basically like, learn the local Fangyan. Like you're here to learn from the peasants. You need to learn the local Fangyan, right? And it's similarly with sort of like revolutionary plays, right? That's one of the places where we get a lot of conflict because they're like, look, is our goal to teach them Putonghua or is our goal to teach them revolutionary content? And if our goal is content, we need to put it in a language that they understand, right? And so you often see sometimes that pops up in official documents, right? And like sort of like the stuff I get in the archives, but oftentimes this just kind of goes under the radar. And so to get at the idea of sort of like mass literacy campaigns, my understanding is that like from the sort of research that I've done, the emphasis there was on literacy. That was the primary goal, right? As far as sort of like perfecting Putonghua pronunciation, there are actors who are really emphasizing this, but I'm not sure that was necessarily the goal on the ground. So I think that I think was what the question was sort of emphasizing, and I agree with you. I think that that's absolutely correct, and that there's a lot more interesting stuff to be done about how an emphasis on pronunciation intersects with or conflicts with this emphasis on literacy, right? Which I think that there are a lot of like people, both before and after 1949, that care a lot more about that than they care about a unified national language. So absolutely true. I have educational programs for minority languages. I think I got, did I?
You sort of touched upon it, yeah. Let's, okay. So maybe we can go for another 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
So maybe we'll do two more rounds. Okay. And so the first round is a couple of questions that really are slightly on the normative plane. And I think they're quite interesting because they're really sort of big questions that are kind of universal. So the first is from Sakura Christmas at Bowdoin College, who says, thank you, Gina, for this rich and fascinating talk on the role of Fangyan in the making of the modern nation state and nationalism. Would you be able to speak more to the relationship between Fangyan and the formation of the Han ethno-racial group in the 20th century and disaggregate race and ethnicity from the nation state? So I guess that's the big sort of normative kind of flash for the conceptual question. And linked to that is the question from, where are my notes now? Sun Yifei. Sun Yifei says, what are the differences between, oh, no, not that one. There's a difference, there's two questions. So Yifei Sun from Cal State University, Northridge. Thanks, Gina. My question for you from the perspective of a scholar, should a country, national government require a standard language? So this is again, a big sort of normative question in some ways. So over to you. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start with Sakura's question. Thank you very much. So in sort of, so returning back to sort of a topic that I touched on, right, is the idea that when I was thinking about, and I tied myself in knots kind of writing this, right, of like, how do I explain this relationship between language and nation and ethnicity, when oftentimes in Chinese, these terms are often sort of conflated, right? So like sometimes you'll get Hanyu Fangyan, right, which gets the word Han in there. Sometimes you'll get Zhongguo Fangyan, right, which gets the political state of China as opposed to the ethnicity Chinese, both of which are Chinese and English, right? And then when we think of what the Han are, right? Is ethnicity the right term? Is race the right term? What is the difference between the two? And how do they relate to language? And this is something that I really, sort of care very deeply about. And where I sort of came down on is first the idea that Fangyan are often used to, people who promote Fangyan as being sort of really important, right? Are often using the topic of diversity to really sort of also exclude, right? That like Fangyan, we're all connected to this Han ethno-racial group. We're all connected to this one core root. And therefore, right, so like essentially sort of like Fangyan is used to exclude as much as it is used to include, right? Whereas ideally sort of like in theory, a national language doesn't have to be linked to history or race or ethnicity, right? The second question here is like, do I sort of like, how do we think of Han as like, do we think of it as ethnicity or a race, or either, right? Is it something else entirely, right? And so on the one hand, the Chinese government calls the Han a minzu, which we often will translate as either, it can be ethnicity, it can also be nationality, if we get into sort of like Stalinist rhetoric as well. The thing is that what's sort of fascinating about the Han is that the normal things we think of as sort of belonging to an ethnicity, right, of like a common culture, language, geography, and these kinds of things, like it just kind of falls apart when we think of the Han because there's just so much diversity, right, in this sort of big, broader group. And that's why I think one of the ways that I think we should continue to sort of study the relationship between language and Han-ness, right? Which I think should, like, I hope studies go beyond my book on this, right? Is essentially looking at how the Han become, I think, racialized, right? Which is, to me, the way I think about this, right, is rather than sticking to this very narrow idea of race as being sort of a biological construct, right? Even though there are parts of that this is true, right? That there are descendants, right? Descendants of the Yellow Emperor is often how a term that we get here for thinking about the like sort of like Fangyan, right? Like people who descendants of the Yellow Emperor speak Hanyu Fangyan, right? So that is some of the rhetoric that we get here that is racialized. But essentially, if we think of racialization as being sort of essentialized and being embodied, right, then I think that it's worth talking about how rhetoric about the Han that basically like this idea of a shared cultural core of like really does get at this kind of like racialization of Han-ness and sort of drawing on other kinds of like scholarship on race and ethnicity outside the United States that I think is really valuable for thinking about that. Should a country require standard language? You know, I try so hard as a historian to not come down on these kinds of questions. To me, the way that I come down on this is that languages are such an integral part of who we are, right? And that I think it is possible to have a national language without sort of like demeaning or sort of like making less important other languages, right? And that even if we are to sort of have a standard national language, that we should be celebrating sort of like linguistic diversity and survival. And if sort of I may, one of the things that sort of like I worry about as a human being, right, as opposed to sort of a scholar trying to narrate this, is that if we devalue people's languages, we devalue who they are. And I don't think that the creation of a national language, or saying like this is the Chinese language abroad, has to come at the expense of other languages, right? And I worry sometimes about policies that emphasize, you know, we can only use Fangyan in these spaces, right? Fangyan are just variants, that has the propensity to really devalue who people are. And so I think if I have any sort of like moral drive in this project, it's celebrating the fact that who we are is like understanding who we are and being able to express who we are is a really, really, it's like a fundamentally important human thing. And that I worry about less about, do we have a national language? Do we not have a national language, right? Then what does that policy look like, and how does it like allow for that kind of expression of selfhood? That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that was compelling. Okay, so we have a mixed bag at the end. You know, so I've been trying to find thematic connections, but these are great questions, but they don't not necessarily sort of speak directly to each other. The first of these is from Alan Baumler at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, who says, how much influence does Soviet language policy have after 1949? I think you briefly touched upon sort of Stalin's idea of nationalities already. And then he adds, great talk, by the way. Then the other question is from Serena Calsagno. Again, apologies if I pronounce the name incorrectly, a grad student at the University of San Francisco. Thanks for your eager engagement and for clearly laying out this talk with fun examples. I'm curious about your thoughts on how this positioning of Putonghua Cantonese in China post Great Leap to today filters into the US imagination, and especially US bilingual education. So that's really connecting it to the US in an interesting way. What does it mean that even though Southern Chinese languages are seen as important in US and California history specifically, and both are considered critical languages, Mandarin has grown as the main dual language Chinese language in the US now. It's become sort of the, that's, and then there's a question from Paul McGregor, who says, why did Northern dialect become dominant, not Northern Mandarin or Southern Mandarin? So, and then that's it, then we'll give you a break. There's one question, but I'm gonna, again, use my privilege, it came in late, so I'll see that later on, yeah. You have the final word now. Yeah.
Okay, mixed bag. I'm excited. All right. I will admit that I know a little less about the US context, but I'll do my very best. I know a lot more about Soviet language policy. And in fact, there's like a whole chapter on it in my book, right? And so essentially what happens, to see how I can do this in a very sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Condensed way, is that in 1951, Stalin writes this pamphlet about Marxism and the problems of linguistics, right, where he basically argues that Marxism imagines this, essentially this like progression of history, right, from like feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism, right, and that the way that languages are not part of the structure or the superstructure, rather they are sort of, they sit apart from that and are connected to nations. So this is Stalin's like desire to basically like exhume the nation and make it a really important part of sort of socialist, communist, Marxist theory, rather than solely seeing things through sort of like class, right? And so this gets translated into Chinese and has like a flurry of scholars at the Chinese Academy of Sciences who are trying to make sense of this in a Chinese context, right? And Stalin says very clearly that like languages represent, nations are represented by languages. So languages represent nations. Those two are twinned, right? And nations are the only sort of like unit that can progress and move forward into these sort of stages, right? Whereas dialects are just variants and they are like doomed to stagnation, basically is how they're gonna fall away, they're gonna disappear. And you get sort of like essentially Chinese scholars dealing with this, right? And Soviet scholars who then get translated into Chinese dealing with this. And so while you have on the one hand this rhetoric in the early 1950s of people saying like, the promulgation of Putonghua is not meant to be at Fangyan's expense, right? That's a big part of what's happening. You have scholars who are arguing like according to Stalinist theory, Fangyan, which are dialects, right, are going to fade away anyway, right? That these are going to die anyway. That this is something that's going to happen. And there's sort of like, and like one particular scholar basically says like, we can make this happen faster, or we can just let it happen naturally, but we can't stop it, right? There's nothing we can do to stop it. And so that sort of frames, I think, the way that people are thinking, in particular scholars of the PRC are thinking about this hierarchy between Putonghua and Fangyan, right? Like, I think it really frames it, which is sort of important. So what US bilingual education, what does it mean that they are important in the United States, whereas you sort of see Mandarin coming in? And I think that sort of you hit on the extent of my knowledge here, which is that, you know, for a long time in Chinese overseas history, you have these Southern languages, these Southern Fangyan, right, being upheld or not being upheld, sorry, being widely spoken, right, among overseas Chinese in the United States. There are a lot of reports in places like California and New York where you have like Chinese language centers for children who want to learn Chinese, being like Cantonese being replaced by Mandarin and being replaced by Putonghua. And that I think there's some pushback against this among overseas Chinese communities. But I think it sort of relates more broadly, which is outside my area of expertise, but I hope to get to in my next project, which is, right, the rise of sort of like overseas nationalism among sort of overseas Chinese communities in the United States, right? That's not universal. I don't want to sort of paint overseas Chinese with a broad brush in terms of how sort of we're thinking about their relationship to Chinese nationalism, right? But sometimes I do see rhetoric like that, right? From Chinese in the United States, where it's like, it's tied to this idea of patriotism. That's about all I know about that. But I think it's a fascinating question, and I wish I could sort of speak more on it. Why Northern dialect instead of Northern Mandarin? Great question. So essentially what they did, so I tried to really interrogate this of sort of like the difference between Beijing pronunciation as standard pronunciation, Northern dialect as base dialect, and then modern vernacular literature as vocabulary and grammar. And the best I could sort of come up with for what they meant by that, right, is that not only do sort of Southern Fangyan have basically, I think it's sort of like an average of these Northern Fangyan that in particular don't carry particular characteristics. There is a Northern-Southern divide linguistically in terms of the Southern Fangyan. Basically, the word is like distinctions, like they have more distinctions among characters than Northern ones do. So for instance, like characters that in Putonghua would be just all pronounced shi. In Cantonese, you'd have like sik and xi and like a bunch of different sort of distinctions, right? And so like classes of phonologies, right? And so I think that that's what that is getting at, as opposed to Beijing Mandarin, right? And when sort of explanations of where that definition of Putonghua comes from is they're trying to say like, this is not just another Fangyan, right? Beijing Fangyan is its own thing. In fact, I have a picture of like, from the Beijing subway from like 2009, where it's like, learn Beijing Fangyan. It's its own thing, right? It's different from Putonghua. And the rhetoric that you get here is that Putonghua goes beyond being just Beijing Fangyan or Beijing Mandarin, because it absorbs the best of all of the other Fangyan. And that's always left rather vague, but that's the explanation, is that it is more than just Beijing Fangyan. It includes sort of the phonetic rules that are similar to, so like, I think basically like if there's a question of like, what is the distinction between these characters, we'll go with sort of like, what are the rules for most Beijing Fangyan, and therefore absorbing the best of all of China's Fangyan, which is just some real sort of fascinating turn of phrase, I think. Okay.
Great. So in some ways, you touched upon the one question that we couldn't ask. It's actually from Wen Sun, which is about connecting this book and this project to your future research, and you kind of alluded to that already. But we'll let you rest.
Wayne, we can talk about it. We'll talk about it at length.
So again, thank you so much. This has been really fantastic, and you can see by the range of questions you got how exciting and how into it people were. So yeah, thank you again, and I hope everyone who's with us still over 60, almost 60 people still, will join me in thanking you for a great talk and a great Q&A.
Thank you so much. Those questions were so much fun. Thank you so much for spending this afternoon talking about my research with me. This is delightful. And thank you, Arnab, for arranging.
No, of course, my pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening if you're on the East Coast, or wherever you are, have a good rest of the day. Thank you.